Well, good morning. Welcome to the Market to Market podcast. I'm Eric Hunt, and we're here with Paul Yeager. Paul apparently need a guest this morning. I'm popular because I'd like to talk about the weather. So either you're coming on here to hopefully hear some useful information, or you're on here to want to throw tomatoes at me next time you see me in the state of Iowa. We'll see.
How dare you be wrong half the time, Eric Hunt?
That might be generous.
You are at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. What's your title there, sir?
Oh, it's long. Assistant Extension Educator of Agricultural Meteorology and Climate Resilience is technically my title.
Okay.
You can call me whatever you want.
I have, and we do. We're recording this a week before it's released. The night before we recorded, there was a big line of storms. There's a big line of storms headed to the eastern half of the United States. Has the weather pattern changed here in the last week? Is this just a pattern change, or is this just normal weather?
Well, it's both. So we have seen a distinct pattern change from what we had earlier in May, when we more or less had a lot of upper level ridging of high pressure across a lot of the western and central U.S. So we were pretty dry across most of this region. Matter of fact, a lot of eastern Nebraska and I think portions of western Iowa had not received any measurable precipitation in the first half of May. And then we've really flipped the switch here with deeper troughing and low pressure getting the west. We've opened up moisture. So we've had a lot of severe weather. And at different points of times in 2026, we've had a lot of severe weather across portions of the southern plains and getting in the Midwest. April was just gangbusters for severe storms in Illinois. I think for a while, they may still actually have the most tornadoes of any state in the country so far in 2026, which would be a bit unusual if that held true for the remainder of the year. But here in recent days, we've seen severe weather really fill in across portions of Kansas, Nebraska, western Iowa. Over here from, my home state, we had hardly had any severe weather in 2026. And in the last 3 days, we've had just constant severe weather across portions of central and eastern Nebraska, including some pretty photogenic tornadoes.
Right. I've seen those photos, making sure they're not AI generated like we've seen. But Eric, I want to discuss your state of Nebraska just a little bit. I keep seeing it over and over again. Those in Nebraska know, yes, it is dry in the west. How dry is it? And I know we'll get to it here with some maps in a little bit, but has that changed given what you just said about pattern changes?
So there was some moisture across portions of central and western Nebraska that really needed it. So there were definitely areas that got a very beneficial couple inches of moisture in the last 3 or 4 days. Unfortunately, the western sandhills, a lot of the Panhandle, where I would say the drought is the absolute worst, didn't pick up that much moisture. Matter of fact, I think some places around Sydney picked up absolutely nothing. And the wheat out there is basically done. Any dry land wheat out there, my understanding is almost none of that's going to be harvested. So to say it's dry out there is an understatement. I was out in the Panhandle and in that portion of the state, more generally speaking, about a month ago. And at that time, I did not see a single blade of green grass at a pasture that wasn't irrigated. I mean, it was, and the wheat was very, very, very short. It is really a dire situation for a lot of folks in that area, and a lot of farmers in the Panhandle that are reliant on surface water because of the Western water issues. I know Allie talked about that a while back on a podcast. That didn't get a whole lot better in the last month. So the amount of water coming in is going to be not only a lot less than usual, it's going to be early, meaning that they're not going to have the water they need when they need it. So a lot of farmers are taking prevent plant as an option this year, just going to put in some type of cover crop or other things for maybe for forage. And this is also, to me, again, this later for cattle, this is bad. We have literally almost no good pasture in the western 2/3 of our state, which is where we have our prime rangeland.
And when you say western 2/3, you could even almost draw that line to Lincoln, right?
You could.
Almost.
Things are better here now. I mean, the drought monitor will change here on Thursday based on stuff that's happened here the previous couple of days. But yeah, even in portions of northeastern Nebraska, we really have not had much moisture. And I think some of that dryness has extended into portions of Iowa, recently, and you do see even some portions of Illinois have been kind of sneaky dry here the last 30 days, but I don't know that's necessarily having a big impact on pastures. But the worst of the pasture conditions really are kind of tending to be in the high plains region in Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, Wyoming, South Dakota.
Okay. Those that are listening to this, I'm going to now put up some graphics. So if you want to watch it, you'll get a little better picture. I'm not going to make Eric describe everything, but I do want to, you kind of teased a little bit about the storms. We've talked I've done interviews in the last couple of years about this tornado belt thing moving north. You mentioned Illinois having a lot of storms, but where are the storms happening, and is it any different than normal here in 26?
I would say at this point in the year, like we're sitting now about May 19th, we're recording this. This doesn't look too abnormal now that we filled in more of Nebraska, more of Iowa with severe storms. I mean, it tends to show you we're also getting precipitation. I would say, though, for Illinois and probably Wisconsin, this is definitely more than usual. But as you just alluded to, we have seen in the last couple of decades, we have seen the tornado alley shift a bit to the east. Now, that is more of a shift out of the southern plains into the more, I'd say, the mid-south region, Arkansas, Tennessee, northern Mississippi. But we also have seen an uptick in tornadoes in places like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. So I do think as we go forward in time, it's very possible that places like Illinois and Indiana and southern Wisconsin may be more vulnerable to tornadoes in places like us, maybe a bit less than normal. We actually did hear the tornado sirens go off in Lincoln on Sunday evening, and that's the first time in a couple of years. Before that, it had been at least 5 years before we'd had tornado sirens here.
Okay. So it's there, it's possible, and I look at some of those areas have changed. They are still dry. I'm looking at Louisiana over to the Panhandle of Florida. That pattern has changed just in the last week since we've also discussed before in those discussions about tornadoes and also wildfires that insurance costs are changing as well. You want to get into this one a little bit?
Sure. So the Wall Street Journal had a very interesting graphic a couple of weeks ago, and it showed like the average homeowner's insurance premium by county in 2025. But it also had a graphic that showed the average homeowner's insurance risk relative, or average homeowner's insurance premium relative to risk. So in other words, if you're seeing yourself in brown or orange, it means you're probably paying more than what your risk is. If you see yourself in the blue, which is what a lot of Iowa is, you're actually probably paying less of the risk. So for example, like in Nebraska, yeah, we have a lot of dark brown there, meaning that we're paying a lot for homeowners insurance premiums compared to some other places in the country. But that's also kind of in line with our risk. Even though the tornado threat has maybe decreased a bit, the hail risk is increased. We have a lot of hail issues. We've had a lot of wind damage. And in recent years, we're also getting wildfires. So we probably are paying about in line with our risk. Other states, depending on how insurance is regulated, may be paying a little bit less. So it's possible Iowa just has a regulation that is a little bit more favorable to consumers, but that also means insurance companies may be more likely to want to flee your state. So
I am looking to the right at the insurance capital of Iowa in Des Moines. So yes, insurance is a big deal in this town and in this state. Eric, when we last talked, you mentioned Allie. Allie was a professor there, or a professor at Colorado State. We talked about weather. This was 3-4 weeks ago when we chatted. You had some freezes come kind of late too.
We did. And to some degree, particularly in the western part of Nebraska and in the high plains, like a freeze in early May is not extremely unusual. Now, that is more unusual, though, in northern Indiana and Ohio. And, you know, some of the issues, I would probably say, I would imagine that might have caused issues with things like corn and soybean that maybe had just emerged, and people maybe have to reduce replant. I definitely heard stories of replanting across portions of south central Nebraska. And for wheat, we did have freeze damage to wheat in Nebraska from freezes between the middle of April and early May. In some years, those freezes would not maybe cause as much damage, but because we were so warm in late winter, early spring, we had the wheat was a lot further advanced than it should have been. And when we got even somewhat normal temperatures or even somewhat below average temperatures, got down below freezing, we have pictures like you see on the right there where we've had some pretty significant freeze damage. And I would just say, in general, the winter wheat in this country is a disaster this year. I don't know what the final yields are going to look like, but I would be shocked if they're anything close to trend. If you just look at Now, granted, this map is slightly old. The USDA made this product, and I don't know if they've made one since. They put this in something last week.
To their defense, the crop is pretty much done being made at this point. You can't do much more damage to something that's already gone because we're headed. But winter wheat, yes, smallest crop since in like 54 years. So yes, significant. Keep going. Sorry.
Yeah, but if you look at where the winter wheat is most prominent, it's either A, in major drought. So a lot of Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas. I think the abandonment in Texas is over 70%. As of May 1st. And I think in Nebraska at that point, they said 35%, but I'd be shocked if it was actually that low. I think it's probably closer to 50%. If you look over further east, there is more winter wheat in portions of Ohio and Michigan, but that just got frozen earlier this month late. And then they've also had just insane amounts of rain in portions of Michigan and Ohio, meaning that they probably had too much water. So there's very few places where wheat's been growing that actually had a good spring. I mean, you really couldn't have drawn up a worse possible spring for winter wheat in this country.
Which translates also to pastures. You alluded to it earlier, and the pasture regions of your area and exactly winter wheat area. There's two parts to this story. Give me the weather part first.
So, yeah, the weather part and the map I'm showing with quick dry. So quick dry combines short-term precipitation, so like the last couple of months, with satellite reflectance of vegetation. So in other words, it's going to show you where you've been drying, where vegetation is really stressed. So for example, and then the numbers on that map are showing the percent of pastures that are reported very poor compared to the latest NASS report. So, for example, you see that 83 in Nebraska. It means that 83% of the pastures are considered poor to very poor. Well, you see a lot of yellow and dark orange on that map, meaning things are very, very stressed. So we've had, especially in parts of the southeast, where we've had a very dry late winter, spring, things have gotten a little bit better near the Gulf Coast. Things are still pretty bad in the Carolinas and Virginia with regard to drought conditions. So pastures there are very stressed. Things are very, very stressed across a lot of the Great Plains region. I would probably say that the Panhandle, Nebraska, is sort of the epicenter of the drought conditions right now in terms of the absolute severity. I mean, literally, you'd be hard to find. Even the weeds aren't growing out there. Like the cheatgrass isn't growing. So I mean, it's bad if the weeds aren't growing. But this basically just kind of shows that a lot of our prime rangeland just yet again is stressed. And this is kind of a broken record. This decade has just been full of years. We have drought for good portions of it. We just cannot get a good long period where we get sustained recovery to actually really get these pastures back in good shape. And I would say at this point, the pastures are probably the limiting factor to getting herd size increase. I hear stories from folks that cover the Panhandle of Sandhills, and the ranchers they're having to make some very tough decisions on selling more cattle. I mean, thankfully prices are high for them right now, but I mean, they would like to build their herd back up, and they literally can't when you're having to import hay from other states.
That's item 2 to this. Yes, that's what I was alluding to, was the livestock portion of this. Give me how big some of these lots are, and we're talking a lot of geography when I look at western Nebraska that has a lot of cows. That is something the market is going to see if they start liquidating, right?
We have more cattle than people in Nebraska. I don't think it's even close. I think Iowa is a little closer. I think you have more hogs than people and more cattle than people, but I think it's a pretty close ratio. But yeah, I mean, realistically, the one part of our state where we don't have as much pasture is a part of the state that is doing a lot better on moisture. And it's the same story in eastern Wyoming, northeastern Colorado. Some of the areas where we have range, a lot of range, like we have a lot of cattle, we're just doing a lot of stress. And it's very difficult to maintain a decent herd size, and they can't feed them. I mean, basically, if you have 8 kids and you're short on food, at some point you got to find food somewhere to feed your kids.
And you don't have to go very far for it to change for a different crop and in a different state. Corn and the corn country and the corn belt, as if we talk about the tornado belt moving, the corn belt moves, lots of water, at least ideal conditions in corn states now.
Yeah, and some places have had too much moisture lately. Some places maybe are slightly dry. But in general, if you look at where we have drought in this country, which is a majority of the country has been in drought. We've actually had record percentages of the U.S. in drought this spring, but the drought has generally not been where we have a lot of corn and soybean production. So like basically only a quarter of our prominent corn and soybean production is in drought. And I point out in Nebraska, a lot of that prime corn and soy area is irrigated where they can to some degree offset some drought impacts. So, and we'll get the forecast a little bit, but right now there is just a low probability, I think, of having major drought issues in the Corn Belt this year for corn and soy. So I think if people are hoping for a drought to increase prices, I don't necessarily see that coming this year.
But there's the plant in dust, your bins will bust. The areas that were dry in spring, are they going to stay that way or do they change? You were just kind of, I know we're going to get to forecast in a little bit. I guess I'm just going to go off the map for a little bit.
Yeah, and granted, some places in the plains were too dry for planting. Some places, I think, further east were too wet. I know there's been folks in Indiana and Ohio, maybe portions of Illinois that have had a hard time getting crops in just because of how wet it was, which is certainly not ideal. You'd rather it be a little too dry than a little too wet, probably, to get stuff in the ground. In terms of where things are going, I think we're probably going to see moisture continue for a good portion of the region. I do think, though, that portions of the upper Midwest, which include probably portions of northern Ohio, northern Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, maybe portions of northern Illinois, may remain a little on the dry side the next 10 days, at least drier than some other places further toward the south and west. So I think that's going to be good news in terms of maybe getting some late field work in and maybe helping get those, you get the roots deeper. Because the good news is further east, if they are dry for 2 weeks, there's plenty of moisture. Those roots are going to find that moisture. And that could be advantageous to actually have a little dry spell later in May, early June. If you have a good reserve of moisture to work with, that means you'll get that good root depth. If it's just wet constantly for the first 2 months of the year, those roots are going to go way down any further than moisture. Plants are like people. They're only going to work as hard as they have to, generally speaking. And if they have all the moisture they need, the top part of the profile, they're going to stay up there. And if you get dry later, that means they don't have the root depth to go down and find the moisture.
I'm just going to use my very localized area. We went 3 weeks, 2 weeks without rain. I think we're going to have a good root system in some parts of Iowa. So I think that's kind of what you're referring to. You alluded to the drought outlook a little bit. What looks to stay that way is going to be that way, really in Mountain Time Zone and Pacific Time Zone. But talk to me, if you could, on the drought outlook of the eastern part of the country. I'm looking at Georgia on up to Pennsylvania. The drought has been below there so far, but you're thinking the way the outlook looks, little change there in the north, not quite full northeast, mid-Atlantic.
Yeah, the CDC, now granted, they'll release another outlook here probably later this week. But their expectation was a drought would persist in that area. I do think that there is a chance that we will see things get a little bit better in portions of Georgia and the Carolinas. We really are dealing with near historic levels of drought across portions of the Southeast. It doesn't quite maybe get as much attention as drought in the West or the Midwest, but when the Southeast gets in drought, they are a lot more vulnerable to wildfires. So we've definitely seen some instances of that here in recent months. I think there's a possibility that some of that area does get a little bit better as we head to the later portion of the summer. I also think that we're going to see a period of time for some decent improvement across portions of the Mid-South, getting into the Delta and portions of Texas. It's really critical that we get that, though, because I do think that there is a decent chance that as we get later into summer, that we do dry back out again across a lot of Texas, maybe Louisiana, Mississippi. That Gulf Coast area 2023 and 2015 really got hammered by flash drought conditions. I mean, we had a really rapid onset of drought. So it wouldn't shock me if you go from really wet to really dry back in that region again. Going a little bit further toward the north and getting into the high plains region, I think there's a very good probability that if you're in extreme or exceptional drought, you're probably still going to be in drought later this summer. We may start getting a little bit more moisture this summer to help things maybe get a little bit better. It's possible that we may see enough to get the pastures kind of going along. But I would just say, though, that just getting back to pastures, we probably in some parts of Nebraska, and this is also probably true across portions of northeastern Colorado and Wyoming, we're probably less than a week away from needing a good rain to actually get the cool season grasses. They won't grow if they don't get moisture the next week. And we're probably not that far away from saying the warm season grasses are going to turn in either, basically meaning that if the next month is really bad, that there will be historic levels of historic shortages of forage productions across portions of the High Plains region, which is really bad for the cattle.
And you're talking long-term impacts. This is not just, if we get rain in 2 weeks, things will grow. You're talking seasons, a long season here.
Yeah, I'm talking the rest of the seasons would be shot, and you would have to have a very impressive fall, a good winter, and a good next spring for next year to turn around. Because usually there is a little bit of memory in the pasture. So if your year before was decent, then usually the following year, even if you are dry, it can be okay. But I think the problem is that in a lot of the prime range area of the High Plains, we were okay last year. We were so historically bad this last winter. The spring has been terrible. So we put ourselves in a situation where if we're not getting the moisture this summer, we're just not going to have much forage production.
So I guess the next two graphs of the shifts in rainfall are going to fall a little deaf in some of those areas, but it is happening in parts of the country.
Yeah. So if you look at this first graph where it shows where the precipitation was from late March through mid-April, it was very, very dry across mid-South through the Southeast. That's why you kind of see some of those drought conditions in Georgia, Alabama, Virginia. We had really significant deficits of precipitation. So that's kind of a wetter time of year in that area. We were very wet, the high I-44 corridor, I-80 from say Western Iowa through Western Pennsylvania was very wet. Then we were historically wet across portions of Wisconsin and Michigan, which is why I think they've had trouble getting crops in the ground. That's probably not good for the winter wheat, just too much, too much moisture in that area. And then very, very dry across the High Plains region. So if you look at Western Nebraska, Western Kansas, those deficits in absolute terms are not what they are in Mississippi and Alabama, but the averages are much different that time of year. That basically means that you got almost no precipitation in eastern Colorado, western Nebraska, western Kansas during that time period. And if we look at what we had recently, we are still fairly dry across portions of the southern plains where we were dry. But you see places like eastern Oklahoma, southeastern Kansas, southern Missouri, which were very wet, have flipped over a lot drier. Got a lot wetter along the Gulf Coast. We are seeing some drought improvements in the Panhandle, Florida, getting into East Texas. We also have gotten drier across portions of Iowa, Illinois, and Michigan. And in some years, I would say that's an issue. But given how wet it was, I would say that actually was pretty useful. And I think just given that I think we're going to turn the faucet back on just enough for a lot of those places, particularly in Iowa and Illinois, to actually get some decent moisture this summer. I'm not overly concerned by the lack of precipitation there in the last 3 weeks.
And that has led to some soil moisture changes. You kind of alluding to, I think some of those things will hold. I will have shown that graphic while you were just talking about there. Let's go to the outlook because of things that have changed for the CPC extended outlook. Temperature-wise, orange means above, middle to above average, right?
Yeah, so the stronger the shade of orange and green, the more confident they are in their projections of it being above average or below average. So what they're showing basically in the first half of June is they're expecting to be warm across most of the country, but they're also expecting it to be wetter than average across a lot of the country. So that would mean a lot of the South is expected to be wet. So we are looking at more subtropical moisture coming in. I do expect it to be pretty wet, the southern plains through most of the Southeast. And I do think there's going to be a chance of getting some beneficial moisture across a lot of the High Plains, Central Plains region, Western Corn Belt. I think we're going to get some precipitation across the Corn Belt, but I don't think we're necessarily looking at it being exceptionally wet. But as I mentioned, I think that's okay. I think right now, as long as we're just getting some precipitation in Illinois and Iowa, Indiana, I think we're going to be okay because I think there is a decent reserve of moisture to work with in that area. Maybe the CPC is showing a little bit drier across portions of Michigan. Again, some of the upper Midwest, maybe a little bit drier than average. But that also, even though I know the CPC is showing them being above average, I think that they're more likely to be probably average to somewhat below average on temperatures. So, I mean, a little cooler, a little drier. Okay, what you don't want as you get in the first part of June is to have it to be very warm and very dry if you are a little short of moisture, because that means you're going to really exacerbate your drought conditions or you're heading into drought.
All right, that's good for the first 20 minutes. For the next 6 hours, we're going to talk about El Niño.
And you know, I talk about this for 6 hours, don't you, Paul?
I know, and that's why I'm saying we should pause and let stations identify themselves here on the M2M podcast. Eric, El Niño has, even since you and I talked last in late winter, El Niño was forming. Now it is what I read all the time. is El Nino here? And if it is here, where is it?
It is here. So where we look for it is in the central and eastern equatorial Pacific. So basically, from about the international date line to South America, south of the equators, where we're around the equators, where we look for it. And where you see the oranges and yellows and reds, that basically means sea surface temperatures are above average. And that is an indication that we are in El Nino. Now, we achieve that because we see a reduction in the easterly trade winds in the eastern portion of the Pacific. So we naturally have more easterly trade winds blowing, pushing the colder water from the coast of South America. We tend to have a lot of upwelling. So the colder water off of the western coast of South America is very cold. So we tend to push that water back toward the west with easterlies. And we have enhanced easterlies. That's a La Nina. This is the reversal. So that means those winds have weakened. We've seen a lot of westerly wind bursts pushing that warmer water from the western side of the Pacific further east. So we are officially in El Nino. Now, I've heard a couple of different terms in the media recently, and I'm not throwing you under the bus here, Paul, but let's see. I've heard Super El Nino is being thrown out there a lot. And this morning, I was actually literally just up at Nebraska Public Media Station doing an interview, and they asked me about Godzilla El Nino. I'm like, well, Godzilla, I think of as Japan, which is not the area I would look for El Nino. But regardless, we are going to be in El Nino as we get into the summer and into the fall and winter. And there is a reasonable probability it's going to be a very strong El Nino. So officially, we say the term strong to very strong, which would mean we're probably going to be between 2 and 3 Celsius warmer than average for sea surface temperatures in the central and eastern Pacific. So that is going to have a major impact on weather around the globe. And I do think that's going to have some impact on our sensible weather this summer, and probably increasingly having an impact on our sensible weather across a lot of the U.S. as we head into the fall and winter and into next spring, which is when we tend to see the biggest impacts to weather from El Nino tends to be during that time period. Summer a little bit less so, but there is historic precedent that summers when we're going into an El Nino, we do tend to see certain features appear.
I like super, mega, ultra. All of those descriptors go good. But
whatever floats your boat.
When you say El Nino, and does that mean that only the United States is in it, or is it globally referred to
global.
as El Nino? Okay, so global, then let's talk about South America briefly, if we could, and the impact El Nino has for them. Because as I looked at, these colors coming off of Brazil are the brightest oranges, and I look at jet stream in that same, not quite the same pattern. But tell me what this El Nino means for Brazil and South America.
So for the southern portion of Brazil and portions of Argentina, it can be a little bit drier, but it tends to be about average. Sometimes it's going to be a little bit wetter. Sometimes it's going to be a little bit drier with an El Nino. El Nino's drought impacts in South America tend to be further north of the Amazon. So we tend to have a lot of now it still rains in the Amazon, but they just get sometimes substantially less than normal. So meaning like northeastern Brazil is most likely going to be in a major drought by the time we get into next spring or our next spring. So be their fall. So they could have a rough next year. Australia is probably going to have a rough time of it. Indonesia, India, parts of China, parts of a lot of sub-Saharan Africa. So we really could be doing some major drought conditions across portions of the world. Other parts of the world, the southern portion of the U.S. this next winter may be very, very wet. We may see some flooding across portions of Southern California or other parts of California. It kind of depends on the year. Sometimes it's all of California. Sometimes it's Southern California. Rarely is it the Northwest. But in the summer, what we tend to see getting closer to home is a little bit more of an enhanced subtropical jet, pushing the better flow into the western and central U.S. And we get that because with the warmer waters across the eastern half of the Pacific, we do tend to have a little bit more heat being released. So we tend to have a little bit more energy transfer. So we tend to have a little bit better flow coming into our portion of the country here in the Midwest. And at times we will see more northwesterly flow aloft coming from the polar jet, which means we're getting more frontal passages, meaning that we're getting a lot of ingredients that we need in terms of atmospheric flow and moisture in place to actually produce decent storms across at least a good portion of the Corn Belt. That does not always include the upper Midwest. So Minnesota, Wisconsin, northern Michigan can be a little bit drier, but most of the prime Corn Belt from eastern Nebraska through Indiana, Ohio tends to do fairly well at times of moisture in the summer months. And then some years that can extend down into Kansas and Missouri, maybe in north Oklahoma, getting into the Mid-South region. So some places do tend to be a bit wetter as we're going into an El Nino. A lot of that will depend, though, on what happens in the northern Pacific. So if we can get waters warming up, right now they are warmer across a lot of the North Pacific, especially if they warm all the way up to basically the Alaska coastline, getting up toward Anchorage, then I would anticipate us probably having a pretty active northwest flow pattern this summer, which translation means probably lots of chances for storms coming in, which means good, which is great for moisture in the Midwest and parts of the South. That also can mean more severe weather, though.
Which goes back to one of the things you said a few minutes ago about, yes, it might be a little bit dry, but you're not too concerned about the rest of the growing season.
And that's exactly it, Paul. So, there are times where if we were heading into a La Nina, particularly if we were heading into a La Nina with a lot of cold water everywhere in the eastern side of the Pacific Basin, we were already turning dry in Illinois, in northern Indiana, Wisconsin, I would be raising alarm bells or sounding alarm bells for major drought being a real problem, or maybe being a real problem across a lot of the Corn Belt. But because I think the expectation is, just based on historic precedent, based on what I'm seeing in most of the global models in terms of seasonal forecasts, I feel fairly confident that most of the Corn Belt is likely to do fairly well with precipitation. That may actually go down into some of the Mid-South region. So portions of Arkansas and Tennessee, I know we have some corn and soy, some wheat and rice production down there. We may actually do fairly well with moisture here the next couple of months. So that's probably good news for the crops down there. Any moisture we get in the Southern Plains, that may be too late for the wheat crop this year, but it may be beneficial in terms of they do have some corn and soybean production down there as well.
And moving ahead towards fall and the next growing season. Okay, you've watched in the pastures, yes. You've watched market to market enough. We love comparisons.
Watch every week.
We love to use numbers that end in 6 and years that end in 2. Let's talk 2015 and 2023 comparison. Why did you put those two together?
So I have those two together because those are the last times that we were going into El Nino in the summer. Now, we were a little further along with El Nino in both 15 and 23 than we are now. We were definitely much further along with El Nino at this point, 2015, than we are now. But I think this isn't a rapidly evolving or quickly evolving El Nino. So I think we're going to catch up to 2023 pretty quickly. So if you combine what happened in both those years, versus both on temperature and precipitation, we kind of see a few things that were similar. One, the Northwest is pretty hot because we tend to have more upper level ridging of high pressure in the atmosphere. In that region is warm and dry. We also got dry and kind of hot, or in 2023, we were very, very hot across Texas and the Gulf Coast region. So I think there's going to be some risk that Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, at some point, maybe toward the summer solstice, flips over hot and dry. But you'll notice, though, a lot of the central U.S. from Kansas, Nebraska, into Illinois, we tend to have decent moisture through most of summer. We also tend to have average to somewhat below average temperatures, which is kind of alluding to getting more of that northwesterly flow, which means we're bringing in cooler air on a more regular basis and also some drier air. And I think that's going to be important. I want to emphasize that if we do get regular frontal passages this summer throughout especially late June through August, I think that'd be very critical for not only bringing us chances of thunderstorms and precipitation and some cooler temperatures, we need to break the streak of years. We've had a lot of southern rust and tar spot issues affecting corn country. Southern rust is horrible in the Western Corn Belt last year. I think it was for other places as well. And one of the reasons for that is if you just have very persistently southerly flow for 7 to 10 days straight in late June and early July, you're bringing those spores up from northern Mexico and Texas, and you have a lot of, there's bringing up that warm, moist air. You're also making it more humid. We had a lot of cloud cover at times this last. So we had very optimal conditions for southern rust. Regular frontal passages with bringing drier air would help break that cycle. So if we could at least have a frontal passage every so often, every week, that'd be nice. For most
ideal.
That also, I think, would reduce the risk of southern rust a little bit this summer. But we'll have to see what happens. I know last year we were not necessarily projecting the Bermuda high to be quite as strong as it was in the first half of summer, which is, I would say, was the main culprit for pumping all that warm, moist air back up here, which is great for getting precip, but also meant that we just had open access to those spores without any break.
Right. And part of that story last year and maybe the year before was it wasn't necessarily clouds. It was haze from wildfires that had, and that also contributed to that. And so
it did.
Given what regularly happens in a pattern could be back to, again, what you've said and shown about it being dry in the West. And if that leads to fires, then we could
absolutely
throws another wrench into that plan.
If Washington, Oregon, British Columbia are hot and dry this summer, if we see fires there, that smoke would probably infiltrate into the Midwest. So that would probably reduce solar radiation a little bit. That would reduce the photosynthesis capacity. So again, I think we actually probably have taken some of the high end yield off our corn crop in particular in recent years, just because of the amount of smoke. And, I get asked quite a few different questions about like how things have changed in recent years. But, some of the questions I get the most are smoke. Like it makes people saying that I don't remember there being this much smoke. I'm like, well, that's because there wasn't. It's becoming, we have more fires in the Northwestern United States and Canada we use. So that's a lot of that smoke makes its way into the central and eastern U.S., which can be a health hazard for people with asthma. But I think it really actually does, if nothing else, it takes off that high end yielding plants. If you get that smoke at the wrong time, particularly right around silking into the early portions of the dough stage, it can really reduce the photosynthesis capacity and will reduce your yield.
All right, Eric, where can we see you?
Oh, you can find me lots of places. So I serve the state of Nebraska, so I'm a statewide educator for my home state. And so, most of the stuff I do, market journals, but the market journals on YouTube. So, I do talk about other stuff going on around the country because what happens around the country does have an impact on prices, of course. Some market journal, I do put stuff on the State Climate Office webpage, nsco.unl.edu pretty often. Run the Crop Watch podcast locally. You're kind enough to invite me on. I was on Fox Weather this morning. So, I get asked to get on different things.
Yeah. And if people want to email you, and you always send me great slides. I just don't always get them used or fully analyzed. If someone wants to email you, they can, and you would probably open a dialogue with them, I'm guessing.
I absolutely would, yes, as long as it doesn't go to my spam folder, which doesn't happen too often, but it does. Also, I don't spend time on TikTok, but I do post stuff on there fairly often. It's a bit more Nebraska-centric, but I do a lot of the maps I show like the anomalies of temperature and precip or severe weather risk or cold risk or something for other parts of the country. So you're welcome to look at that page as well. I like talking about the weather. I like saying things that are useful occasionally, and hopefully I said something useful and accurate today.
Why start now? No, it'd be good. Eric, we'll get you back. I'm looking July. I think it'd be pretty good because we need to give you a mid-growing season update. So we'll catch back up later this summer. How about that?
That sounds good. Thanks, Paul.
All right. Thank you very much. That's Eric Hunt here on this week's MTOM podcast. We are produced at Iowa PBS. Our production supervisor is Sean Ingracia. His crew is Reed Denker, Kevin Rivers, Julie Knudsen, Neil Kyer, and David Feingold. The executive producer of Market to Market is David Miller. I'm Paul Yeager. We'll see you next time.